Welcome on into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and it is time to go over some interesting, mostly it's storylines with training camp opening up all around the NFL. Things are starting to happen, and players' injuries are happening. Their injury statuses are becoming more known. And so, a couple of things here in this video. Eight quicker storylines that we will cover. As a quick plug, Tuesdays and Thursday evenings, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have been doing live mock drafts, practicing for our fantasy football mock drafts. It's been great. We've almost got a complete room already this off season, so that has been very promising. So please come join us. Let's make it so that there are no bots left, so we can get some really good practice against one another for our real fantasy leagues. With that out of the way, let's start off with the first report that I have in this video. Reports are coming out about teams' interest in free agent wide receiver Keenan Allen. And it was kind of funny because this report came out. I can't recall exactly if this was the same day or a day after. I was thinking exactly about this thing, about Keenan Allen, and about how, I mean, he's going to go somewhere, probably. I think there's still enough left in him, and where's it going to be? And that's probably going to impact fantasy. To talk a little bit about him, first of all, I mean, this could ruin somebody's fantasy value, even tank two fantasy values, depending on the situation, the team that he goes to. One of the teams that I wonder if they're interested in him would be San Francisco, and we'll touch back upon that. We have a little bit more San Francisco news a little bit later on, but that would be a team that I would definitely find interesting for him. I think that would be a nice system fit, and with all the injuries and everything going on in that wide receiver core, I would think that they at least have talked about it and thought about it. Also, of note is that last year he was still fantasy relevant, despite the fact that he was pretty clearly misused in Chicago. I think at his aging age, he had one of the deeper or deepest average route depth of his entire career, and that's just not his best strong point. So all the more reason to think that if a team were to use him more properly, he can still go out there, compete, and be something. Let's bring us on to the second topic here, and that is some words coming out of Tua Tagovailoa's mouth talking about Tyreek Hill. He says that Tyreek Hill and him are quote-unquote rebuilding their relationship after Tyreek Hill's quote-unquote I'm out comment after last season. Is this news? Is this noise? I tend to think it's noise for the purpose of the fact that I really don't know how much you can really act upon such a statement in terms of fantasy football drafting, but I do think that this is a little bit a tip in the cap for Jalen Waddle, a little bit more concern for Tyreek Hill. The problem is that we know the upside of Tyreek Hill, and at a certain point in the draft, not too late into it, it becomes very hard to pass up on that potential. But is this an opportunity for Waddle to earn his trust a little bit more? Does he target Waddle a little bit more in practices? Does that relationship grow as the relationship between Tyreek Hill and his teammates, especially his quarterback, seems to be, I don't want to say poor or bad, but seems to be something that has been strained? I think that's definitely a possibility. To bring us on to the third topic here. Talking about Joe Mixon. He was placed on the NFI, the non-football injury list, in order to start Houston's training camp. Is this news? Is this noise? I tend to think that this is news. You gotta read the tea leaves a lot of the time in the offseason. Things aren't always just spelt out for you. You gotta read between the lines. What's the team doing? And based on what we know, why are they doing that? And to what extreme, what have they done to potentially secure themselves in case maybe things are a little bit worse than they are front-facing to us as the fans. Now, what I will say real quick, this is great for my lack of stock in Joe Mixon and my stocks in Nick Chubb. Dameon Pierce also on the, I think it's the NFI list. I don't believe it's the PUP list for him either, which is also, it's better that these are on the NFL list and the PUP list, but not necessarily a whole lot better. And this situation feels a lot like situations we've seen in the past, most, infamously at this point in time, the last year's offseason for Christian McCaffrey. 2 months ago, a little bit of reporting comes out about Joe Mixon, who sustains an ankle injury, and around that same time, he's seen in a boot. Then, not too long later, somewhere in between then and now, they go out, closer to now, they go out and they add Nick Chubb. And then now this happens. It's starting to feel like, that's just not a great sign. We'll just say it like that. 2 months later, an ankle injury still holding him back. There are concerns. There are potential issues there. Obviously, we can't know to what extreme, but I would be a little bit more concerned about taking Joe Mixon where his ADP has been currently at, and I think you have to start to think of the potential of taking Nick Chubb later in drafts. That's going to bring us on to some news about Matt Stafford. He has begun training camp, quote-unquote, off to the side with back soreness. Now, this is not something incredibly new for Matt Stafford. He has been injured in the past. He has had back issues in the past, and just 2 years ago, we definitely saw that impact his play, and he doesn't have the best offensive line around in the league around him. Now, head coach Sean McVay has come out and said that this is not expected to be a major issue, and I don't doubt that, but I do think, news or noise, that we have to take this a little bit as news, as a reminder of the fragility of that situation. Now, the good news for the other fantasy players on that offense is Jimmy Garoppolo is the backup. I know it's Jimmy Garoppolo, but he's familiar with the system. He's done well in the system before. That's not a bad backup to have if it's a 2 or 3 week thing. You definitely don't want that to be 8 weeks, of course. But I do think when we're drafting Puka Nacua so high up in the draft, that's the area where you don't want to take too much risk in a draft. And maybe you draft one of those other guys ahead of him just out of pure concern for Matt Stafford's health, the longevity of that situation, him making it through this year. I would say of all the quarterbacks in the NFL, he's outside of like non-injury reasons, one of the ones that you have to be the most concerned about potentially missing some time just because of who they are, where they're at in their career, and their past histories. So, news, don't go overboard, but, we're also drafting Adams fairly highly. I mean, those guys would take a knock if we go back to Jimmy Garoppolo, of course. That's going to bring us on to a small, quick one here for the 49ers, retouching back on them. They sign wide receiver Equanimous St. Brown, bring in a veteran, camp body for the most part, but I am going to call this noise, but it is a sign of how thin their wide receiver room truly is, and I think, potentially, their expectations long-term of how things may not get better so quickly, most notably for Ayuk, and hopefully not, but potentially for Ricky Pearsall. So, once again, you're not looking into this signing and drawing too much from it, but it's a red flag in general for that situation, and probably a greener flag for Juwan Jennings. And this comes to something I was thinking about the other day. We see how banged up this wide receiver room is, potentially, and are we a little too bold, and I'm definitely one of them, on Brock Purdy? Is this going to impact his performance this year if that wide receiver room just is never too healthy this year again? Given his history as a fantasy quarterback, it's tough to hold it against him too much. He's done well with banged up receiver rooms and everything, and he's still got George Kittle. That's the crutch that has held him up, and he can keep holding up on that crutch, I believe, for another season. That's to bring us on to a little bit of news about Las Vegas rookie wide receiver Jack Bech, who I have definitely higher up in my rankings than some others, and he is in the early portion here of the training camp, running with the twos. Is this news, or is this noise? And I lean towards noise, actually. In fact, I lean towards it potentially being a little bit of good news. I don't think that this should be a huge surprise, given the role that a lot of people pictured for him, and I do think that he has the potential to be an extra receiver, but I don't think while Jakobi Meyers is there that need is truly there. Maybe Deontay Thornton's like the X. These things are different system to system. Wide receivers play different roles within them, but nonetheless, I think good news that he is the one riding behind Trey Tucker and not behind Jakobi Meyers. That would make it a little bit harder for him to get onto the field more. And good news because of that role. We talked about Keenan Allen just a little bit ago. I mean, could Jack Bech be the next Keenan Allen? I do think that skill set is similar enough for Jack Bech in a lot of ways. They're different, but there are some similarities there. And he could definitely be that power slot who's getting a lot of targets. It's easier. We saw it last year with Marvin Harrison Jr. trying to learn that X role. There's a lot more on a player's plate. They're playing against a lot better cornerbacks when you're that X receiver compared to when you're doing something like from the slot. A lot easier to work from. So he's currently starting behind Trey Tucker, and then they have the rookie that they drafted later, Deontay Thornton, on the field with their ones and their three wide receiver sets, being the field separator that he is, the deep threat, pure deep threat. And I think that makes sense to have him on the field. But you don't keep that deep threat on the field in two wide receiver sets. And I also don't think that Jack Bech is going to remain behind Trey Tucker for very, very long. So something that we're going to keep our eyes on. For me, this is noise, but I still expect Jack Bech to be the wide receiver 2 in two receiver sets. And it looks like to be the power slot, which I actually like in terms of more easy targets coming his way throughout the season. So overall, I think, if anything, kind of good news, obviously with a little bit of hesitation. Michael Penix throwing a lot to Kyle Pitts at practice. Is this news? Is this noise? And I think that this is news for some people, not everybody, because there's enough people out there who have completely written Kyle Pitts off, and I don't think that you can count Kyle Pitts off at this younger point in his career based on also some early injuries that he has still been coming back from. Kyle Pitts' breakout year this year, it would not be the most shocking storyline to happen, in my opinion. And on top of this, Michael Penix had a quote saying that, essentially, I'm not actually quoting it, that we should get used to that happening much more regularly throughout the entirety of this upcoming season. So, when it comes to Kyle Pitts and where you can get him in drafts, I think he's definitely worth a late shot if you're a person who takes two tight ends in your draft. The upside is definitely there. So that is it for this information. Thank you very much for tuning in. Hope to see you for those mock drafts. There should be a link in the description. Otherwise, there's a link in the description for most of my videos to my rankings. Those are pretty consistently getting updated at this point in the season as news and noise comes out, and making some, taking in information and adjusting priors that I had from my off-season research that I did myself, and saying, that's a good point. So in general, Dallas, I've gotten higher up on them because of the good Dak Prescott news lately. Just across the board, outside of the running back position, which is a different story between Javonte and Jaden Blue. Some good news coming out for Javonte, bad news for Jaden Blue and his work ethic. But I've talked about that previously. We're going to keep this one a little bit shorter. So don't forget to like, subscribe, tune in for more. See you guys around. Peace out.